Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering the Illithid Powers. This is one of the videos I've been asked to do the most of any video, and today we're finally getting to it. The Illithid Powers are abilities that you unlock through story events throughout the game. This means that they're unlocked in a different way than abilities that you get through level ups, and because they're unlocked by finding and consuming Illithid tadpoles, which are available in certain locations or by defeating certain enemies, they are limited in number. They're optional abilities, but incredibly powerful, and because they're limited in number, knowing which ones are good to take and which ones aren't good to take can give your party a tremendous leg up by making sure that you select the right ones. Because these abilities are unlocked through story events, there will inevitably be a couple story spoilers as we go through this tier list. I just want to warn you about that now. I will try to keep them to a minimum, but these abilities come from story events, so it is going to be hard to avoid talking about certain story events as we go through. Today we're going to be talking about the first tier Illithid powers, the ones that are available in Acts 1 and 2 that show up in the central and middle rings of the brain when you look at the interface in the game, and then we'll talk about the elite tier Illithid powers later on. I've divided the Illithid powers into 5 different tiers, but before I get into the individual tiers, I should mention that these abilities are extremely powerful. Even the low-tier Illithid abilities are very powerful abilities, and you get them on top of your character's normal class abilities and normal item progression and so on. So these are not only very powerful abilities in their own right, they're also free value on top of what your character can normally do. For that reason, even the C or D tier Illithid powers are very strong overall for your character, so just because something ranks low on this list doesn't mean it's not a very powerful ability relative to Baldur's Gate as a whole. In S tier, I've placed abilities that are extremely powerful. These are mainstays that you should prioritize unlocking. In A tier, ones that give you strong abilities regularly or very powerful abilities occasionally. In B tier, ones that will be solidly useful throughout the entire game. In C tier, ones with more situational uses. These will come up sometimes, but you may not use them in every encounter. And in D tier, ones that are generally weak, but do definitely have uses and options throughout the entire game. If you've watched my previous tier lists, you will note that we are missing 2 tiers that I sometimes use, the S+ tier and the F tier. That's because there are no Illithid abilities that are completely useless. They all do have use. Yes, even the one that you're thinking of. And S+ tier I typically reserve for abilities that operate outside of the normal or intended balance of Baldur's Gate 3 or of Dungeons & Dragons, but that doesn't make sense as a category to talk about the Illithid powers because that's the whole point. The whole purpose of these abilities is that you make certain story choices to get abilities that break the normal rules. So it doesn't make sense to talk about them breaking the intended game balance because they all do. That's the whole purpose of these abilities. The other important thing to talk about before we get into the Illithid powers is the Zaith'isk. The Zaith'isk is a story event near the end of Act 1 that will allow you, if you pass a series of checks, to permanently gain the buff that turns all of your Illithid powers that normally require an action to use to requiring a bonus action to use. Needless to say, this is an incredibly powerful ability that significantly increases the value of these powers. Many of them are not worth spending an action on, but absolutely worth spending a bonus action on. So we have to decide whether we're evaluating the powers based on their action usage or their bonus action usage, or sort of a mix of the two. I'm going to be going for a mix of the two, but leaning towards assuming that they're a bonus action, because if you're planning to unlock a lot of Illithid powers, you are heavily incentivized to try to get the Zaith'isk effect, and if you prepare properly, you can get it fairly reliably. So we're going to assume for the most part that so I'll talk about whether these powers are worth using as an action, whether they're worth using as a bonus action, but to break ties, I'm going to be assuming that you have the Zaith'isk effect and they're a bonus action. Without any further ado, let's start rating these powers, and we're going to start with Illithid Persuasion. The Illithid Persuasion is a slightly odd one to rate because you don't actually make a decision about whether or not to take it, you just start with it, but I thought I would talk about it just for the sake of completion. Illithid Persuasion only works in dialogues, and only with certain characters who have the brand of the Absolute, and it basically allows you to replace certain dialogue checks in the game with a DC 2, that's 2 exactly, wisdom check. Obviously a DC 2 is very easy to hit, but it gets even better because after you've done 5 of them, you don't even have to make that check, so you can't even fail by rolling a natural 1. This gives you a few options for just passing some dialogue checks throughout the game. They're not extremely powerful, and you won't get a massive advantage out of this typically, but there's a couple fights that it can make significantly easier by giving you allies for that fight, and some dialogue checks you wouldn't be able to pass otherwise. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one because you don't actually have to make a decision about it, but it's useful throughout the game, so we're going to rate it B tier. Next, Psionic Overload. So Psionic Overload is going to test what I talked about with the Zaith'isk, because it's an action that's way, way better if you get it as a bonus action. Psionic Overload requires an action and cannot be used outside of combat, so you cannot pre-cast this before combat starts. It's a self buff that gives you 10 turns of an effect, where at the end of every turn, you take 1d4 psychic damage, which obviously is a downside, but all of your attacks deal an additional 1d4 psychic damage. That sounds like an even trade, but it's extremely not an even trade, because it works on every single attack that you do. If you're making multiple attacks in a round, thanks to extra attack, then you're going to be doing additional damage. If you are critically hitting, then it's going to multiply the damage. If you are making attacks that deal multiple attacks in a single action, things like Eldritch Blast or Scorching Ray, then you're going to multiply the damage per attack, because it does this additional 1d4 psychic damage on every single attack that you roll in a turn. Is that worth spending a full action on? Usually not, because you're giving up a full round of attacks to make subsequent attacks better, but is that worth spending a bonus action on? Absolutely. The amount of damage that this does is incredible if you have the Zaith'isk, and so you can cast it as a bonus action, make a bunch of attacks. Even if you don't, you can still activate this with like a hasted action or a bloodlust action, only give up a single attack for it, to make every subsequent attack in the combat significantly stronger, and even there it's still good. But where this really shines is if you have the Zaith'isk. The only real downside of taking 1d4 psychic damage, because the actual HP loss is not significant, is that it does make it harder to concentrate on spells. So this is less useful on a spellcaster that wants to be concentrating on something. But on any character that's just making a bunch of attacks in a round, this is a very powerful ability that'll increase your damage quite significantly, and one that I like quite a lot. I'm going to, like I said, it's going to test the thing that I said about the Zaith'isk, where we're assuming that you are able to cast these as bonus actions, because I'm going to place this ability in S tier. I think it is that strong when cast as a bonus action. The amount of damage that you get is immense. If you kill an enemy a turn faster, then the damage mitigation of killing the enemy a turn faster is going to make up for any damage you might take. So this ability just significantly improves your ability to kill enemies. It's obviously incredibly good for Eldritch Blast builds or Scorching Ray builds or things like that, but any character that's making a bunch of attacks can benefit very heavily from Psionic Overload. I like this ability a lot. The only thing that's holding it back is that you can't precast it before combat starts, but if you can get it as a bonus action or find a way to use a less valuable action on it, like a hasted or bloodlust action where you could only make a single attack with it, Psionic Overload is going to be excellent, so I'm rating it S tier. Favourable Beginnings. Favourable Beginnings is a passive feature that just activates whenever you make an attack or roll an ability check against a new creature. Once you've unlocked it, it just works every single time, and the first ability check or attack roll you roll against a specific creature, whether that be in dialogue or in combat, you add your proficiency bonus again to. So if you're making an attack roll, you're going to add twice your proficiency to it. If you are making a dialogue check, you're going to add twice your proficiency to it if you're proficient in that dialogue skill, 3 times if you have expertise, which is extremely powerful for dialogue because it means that you're just going to pass dialogue checks very regularly. Most dialogues, you only have to roll one die against that enemy anyways, so you get the full benefit of Favorable Beginnings on all of the checks that you're going to need to make against certain foes or certain characters in order to pass their dialogue checks. And also, you gain this bonus on your first attack in combat, meaning that it triggers on the most important attack in every combat. Obviously, landing your first attack is more important than landing all your subsequent attacks, because you might kill them with your first attack, and also you're probably inflicting a bunch of effects, especially if you're going for an Illithid Power build with your first attack, that makes subsequent attacks easier to land. So Favorable Beginnings is very powerful both for combat and for dialogue. But the thing that makes this ability really, really good is just that it is passive. It requires no resource expenditure other than the actual TADPOLE, and you're likely to want to unlock it because it unlocks later things anyways. It unlocks Luck of the Far Realms and Charm. So it's not like you're spending this resource that you wouldn't be spending regardless. So there's almost no opportunity cost. There is no cost to using it throughout the game, and it just makes your character that much more reliable, makes any party face significantly better at passing dialogue checks, makes you better at sneaking past characters, makes you better at attacking characters, and landing attacks is one of the most important things to do. Any character that attacks wants bonuses to their attack rolls. It's especially good for characters that are doing one big attack, things like paladins or rogues that just really want to land an attack so they can use smite or sneak attack effectively. Favorable Beginnings is just a very powerful effect. It's somewhat subtle because it's a passive feature, so you're not going to notice it making lots of flashy particles throughout the entire run or anything like that. It won't make a gigantic explosion, but it's a very powerful ability, and bonuses to hit are incredibly strong. Bonuses to your dialogue skills are very useful throughout the entire game. Favorable Beginnings is just good. It's just extremely powerful and S tier. I'm trying to think of interesting things to say about this other than just numerical bonuses are good and passive numerical bonuses are great, but really that just sums it up. Great spell. Force Tunnel. Force Tunnel is an action, so again, it will gain a significant boost if you've picked up the Zaith'isk and can use it as a bonus action, and it's a central ring power that unlocks Displace and Repulsor when you unlock it. It recharges on a short rest, and as an action, or again, bonus action with the Zaith'isk, you can move 30 feet in a straight line, knocking back all creatures and objects along the way, 13 feet backwards. People tend to overlook Force Tunnel because, as an action, it's quite weak. It's a very you can already move 30 feet as an action just with the dash skill, although this does combine dash and disengage into one thing because it doesn't provoke attacks of opportunity along the movement. So you do get sort of dash and disengage as one action, which already in and of itself isn't terrible. But the really cool thing about this power is the knockback, and the knockback has no saving throw. It also doesn't matter how large the enemy is. If they're vulnerable to being knocked back at all, Force Tunnel can punt them backwards off of cliffs, into hazardous locations, away from allies so that those allies can move away without provoking attacks of opportunity, and so on. And that in and of itself is very powerful. A no-save knockback isn't always worth an action, but sometimes it is, and the fact that it comes with a reposition alongside that means that even when you don't have the Zaith'isk, this is an okay ability that will come up very occasionally. As a bonus action, though, this ability is sick. Being able to dash as a bonus action is one of the powerful features of the Rogue class. You get it at 2nd level Rogue, and this basically gives every character access to that once per short rest, which is already very good. Plus, no save knockback as a bonus action is awesome. Being able to reposition your character with 30 feet of additional movement speed and no save knockbacks on enemies as a bonus action is really good. Is it going to win fights by itself? Usually not. Enemies will need to be near cliffs or something for it to have an effect, but anything that has no saving throw associated with it is always really interesting and really powerful, and so Force Tunnel, if you have the Zaith'isk, is actually quite good. I'm going to place it in B tier because I think it will be useful throughout the game. You're going to find good uses for it if you have it as a bonus action. It would be probably C tier if you don't get the Zaith'isk, buff, but the ability to reposition your character is always powerful, and the ability to knock back enemies is great. Concentrated Blast. Concentrated Blast is another action that again becomes a bonus action with the Zaith'isk. It allows you to, when you are concentrating on a spell, use Concentrated Blast to deal 3d6 damage to any target within 30 feet. If you do that, the spell you are concentrating on ends immediately. If the enemy is concentrating on a spell, you also heal for 3d6 hit points. So you deal 3d6 psychic damage, but lose concentration on a spell, and you have to be concentrating on a spell to use it. The trick here is that you don't have to be concentrating on a good spell, right? You can use this alongside a cantrip with concentration, like Guidance or Resistance, or alongside a day-long ritual spell, like Disguise, or like Detect Thoughts, which is a ritual, so it doesn't cost you a spell slot to use, and you can just be concentrating on that all day before expending it on Concentrated Blast. So you can effectively use this once per combat without spending an action on setting it up, and as long as you have the appropriate cantrip, you can always use it without spending a spell slot. If you have this as a bonus action, you can cast Guidance on yourself and then immediately discharge it for 3d6 damage, which isn't a terrible use of a turn, though by the time that you get that, you probably have typically better uses for a turn, because you won't be able to have this as a bonus action until late in Act 1. The key with Concentrated Blast, though, is that there's no saving throw against the damage. You don't have to roll to hit or save. And again, anything that's 100% guaranteed is always fairly interesting. So you can use Concentrated Blast as kind of a free magic missile, provided you have it as a bonus action. Like you can cast Guidance on yourself and then bonus action could discharge that Guidance with Concentrated Blast just to finish off a low health enemy or something. But it prevents you from concentrating on other spells if you want to do it in that sense. So you won't be able to use this that frequently. People like to build around Concentrated Blast because it's a pretty cool ability, but you're kind of trading a spell that you your concentration slot, because you won't be able to use concentration on a real spell, for the ability to fire off a magic missile. And I just don't think that most of the time Concentrated Blast is going to be worth losing your actual spell concentration for. On characters that don't have other important uses for their concentration and can get it from other things, Concentrated Blast can be marginally useful. And again, no saving throw damage is always interesting. There will be times where this comes up, but I think overall Concentrated Blast is relatively weak and not one that I would recommend worrying too much about unlocking early, except that it does unlock, when you learn it, it does unlock Psionic Backlash and Cull the Weak, which include one of the most important Illithid powers, so you're probably going to want to learn Concentrated Blast just because of what it unlocks. Overall, though, I think this is our first D-tier power. It has some uses, and you can definitely get some cool stuff out of it, but you won't miss it if you don't have it. Transfuse Health. Transfuse Health is another action, so again, this can be a bonus action if you have the Zaith'isk, although that matters a lot less for this one because you typically won't be using it in combat. It allows you to sacrifice half of your current health in order to heal a target by that much. So you sacrifice half of your hit points to give any ally half of your hit points in total. The key here is that you don't actually sacrifice half your health, you deal half of your total HP, of your current HP in damage to yourself. But that current HP total doesn't count temporary hit points, doesn't count damage reduction, and so on. So if you have resistance to damage, you can resist the damage that you are dealing to yourself. And if you have temporary hit points, you can use this ability to turn them into real hit points on an ally. Overall, there are some cool things that you can do with this, where you heal an ally back to full if they've taken a bunch of damage, or if your character has an easier way to heal. If you have the durable feat to gain all of your hit points back on a short rest, you can use it to keep your party full health. But out-of-combat healing is so free in Baldur's Gate 3 that a an ability that's sort of based around out-of-combat healing just isn't one that I'm that interested in picking up, because you just get potions coming out your ears, so you just don't really need to prioritize out-of-combat healing. There's definitely some cool things you can do with this. Being able to turn temporary hit points into real hit points is pretty fun. And in an emergency, you could bring a low-health ally back to full health, especially if you can use this as a bonus action. But overall, I believe Transfuse Health is also D tier. Not totally useless, but is not going to be tremendously impactful in general. Stage Fright. So this is our first of the middle ring powers. In order to unlock Stage Fright, you have to have unlocked Psionic Overload already, but of course Psionic Overload is very good, so that's not a particular cost in order to access Stage Fright. Stage Fright is another action that again can be used as a bonus action with the appropriate story event, and it is an AoE debuff spell cast on enemies. It has a 60-foot range and a 20-foot radius, so it's a very large area of effect, and recharges on a short rest, so you effectively get this ability pretty frequently. Enemies who are in the effect have to make a wisdom saving throw, or they receive the Stage Fright debuff for 3 turns, which gives them disadvantage on their attack rolls, and every time they miss an attack, they take 2d6 psychic damage. But if they hit an attack, then the effect ends. So enemies have good ways to break out of it, but they will at least take disadvantage on 1 attack roll if they fail the save. At this point, it's also, because this is our first Illithid Power that has a saving throw, it's worth talking about the Illithid Power saving throws. Illithid Powers use the item saving throw rules, not the spell saving throw rules. So they're going to use the spellcasting modifier of the last class you took a first level in, the last new class you took. It's very unintuitive, but what this means in general is that if you are like a monoclassed spellcaster, you're going to be good at casting these Illithid powers that have save DCs. If you are a martial character or a character that's heavily multi-classed, chances are pretty good that you will not succeed on these save DCs that often. So in general, these ones that cause enemies to make saving throws are better used on monoclass characters, better used on spellcasters, because they're more likely to have high save DCs for these spells. This debuff isn't in and of itself that powerful, but the fact that you can hit like basically every enemy in an encounter with it is pretty nice. Disadvantage on attack rolls is not the most tremendously strong thing that you can be doing, but will prevent some damage to your party. Usually I would say that's not going to be worth an action though, but it will absolutely be worth a bonus action. The ability to debuff every enemy in an encounter as a bonus action is just really nice, and Stage Fright with an AoE debuff that can prevent damage to your party, deal a little damage to enemies if they miss attacks, and cause enemies to have wonky targeting because their attacks will be made with disadvantage, and that'll mess with the targeting AI, is pretty powerful. So this is one that I would almost never use if I didn't have the Zaith'isk buff, but will be pretty useful if you do have it. Overall, it's still a fairly minor benefit throughout the game. It will prevent some damage and be reasonably good. You might get a little bit of psychic damage out of it, but the fact that it is castable as a bonus action makes it really nice when you have the Zaith'isk buff. I'm going to place it in C tier because it does require a bonus action cast. It will be a reasonably powerful debuff when you can land it, but not every character is going to be able to reliably land it because of the save DC issue, and it requires the Zaith'isk in order to be usable in most circumstances. But when you get it for free, it's just a nice upgrade to your ability to win combats, because it just means a lot less damage that you're going to take over the course of the run. Ability Drain. Ability Drain is the other power unlocked by Psionic Overload, so again there's almost no cost to getting to Ability Drain because Psionic Overload is so good. Ability Drain is a passive that whenever you attack, the target of your attack, if you hit with the attack, receives a -1 penalty to the stat that you used to make the attack with. It's a little confusing, but basically, if you make a melee attack that's not a finesse weapon, it'll reduce the enemy's strength. If you make an attack with a short sword, dagger, or other finesse weapon, or a ranged attack with a bow, it'll reduce their dexterity. And if you make a spell attack, it'll use your spellcasting modifier. So if you're a warlock with Eldritch Blast, it'll reduce the enemy charisma. This is obviously by far at its best if you're reducing enemy dexterity, because that's going to reduce their armor class, and also for many enemies their ability to hit. So this is going to be best for archers. It only works once per turn, so you can't stack it by making multiple ability drain attacks with the same character in a turn, but you can stack it by having multiple members of your party using ability drain and having them all attack using the same attribute. So if you have multiple melee characters with ability drain, you can shut down the enemy strength pretty quickly. In and of itself, draining 1 or maybe 2, if you've got this on multiple characters, from an enemy's attribute scores is not a debilitating debuff. Reducing enemy strength by 1 maybe makes it slightly harder for them to hit you. Reducing enemy dexterity maybe makes it easier for you to hit by 1 armor class. But over the course of long fights, this can add up. But the real key here is just that it's completely free. Enemies don't get a saving throw against it, it's just passive and free, it doesn't require any action economy usage, so as long as you have ability drain unlocked, you're just going to be getting this passive benefit over time. In long fights, it can start adding up, so it will, despite the relatively low amount of effect that each individual stack has, still be a fairly significant impact on your character's effectiveness, and even marginal impacts are great when they are completely for free. So a passive benefit like this, even if it's not a significant bonus to your ability to hit over time, even small bonuses that you just get passively and for free are great. I think it is slightly worse overall than Favourable Beginnings, because it gives you the hit bonus later on in the fight. So in terms of its actual effect, it requires a couple turns of setup or multiple characters. So Favourable Beginnings I like more than Ability Drain, because it applies to the most important attack rather than the later in the fight attacks. But Ability Drain is very similar in that it will just make your attacks easier to hit or make enemies hit less hard and less frequently over the course of long fights, and is passively great as a result. Ability Drain is also, incidentally, a condition that you apply to enemies, and there's a lot of effects that care about applying conditions. Things like Reverberation or Radiant Orb can benefit a lot from just passively applying conditions, so you can use Ability Drain to add more condition applications for those kind of effects, and it's very powerful in that sense. I'm going to place it in A tier because while it is an amazing thing that it is just a passive benefit that you get throughout the entire game, the actual benefit itself is relatively marginal, but when you get a marginal benefit for free, that adds up to a pretty excellent ability that you should definitely get. Luck of the Far Realms. Luck of the Far Realms requires Favourable Beginnings, which again you're going to want to unlock very early, so it has very little opportunity cost for getting to Luck of the Far Realms, and it is another passive, but it's a passive that recharges on a long rest. Luck of the Far Realms allows you to, as a reaction, so it does consume your reaction for the turn any successful attack, any attack that you hit an enemy with, into a critical hit. So any attack that you hit that's not already a critical, you can spend your reaction with Luck of the Far Realms to make it a critical hit. Obviously, guaranteed criticals are great. That's the whole point of playing an assassin rogue, for example, but anytime you can guarantee a critical, it's excellent, especially for characters that are really incentivized to get criticals, like paladins, rogues, the Lightning Lord build, things like that. Any character that's making single high damage attacks that they can multiply massively with Luck of the Far Realms can easily use this to one-shot important targets. Because it only comes back on a long rest, you'll only get to use it in one fight per day, so it's going to depend a little bit on how often you long rest. Just like with my spells tier list, I'm going to assume you don't long rest after every fight, and so you only get to use this in a couple fights. The effect is incredibly powerful if you're a build that's doing that cares about getting critical hits at all. So any martial build at all cares about Luck of the Far Realms, or any spellcasting build that uses attack rolls cares about Luck of the Far Realms. It's obviously not very useful for pure spellcasters or support characters that won't be making attack rolls, but for any character that benefits from critical hits, it's great. Because this is an insanely powerful effect, but limited by long rest and limited in the number of characters that can use it, I'm going to place it in A tier, because I think that Luck of the Far Realms is a really broken effect, but only getting it once per day does balance it out somewhat. Overall, though, still just an incredibly strong effect if you're a character that can use it at all, and definitely one to prioritize. S tier, of course, on paladins or rogues or lightning builds. But on normal characters, still just really good, because the ability to turn a normal hit into a critical hit means enemies dead faster, and that's what we're here for. Charm. Charm is a defensive reaction. It requires your reaction to use, and it works similarly to Cutting Words or Warding Flare or the Shield spell in that you respond to an enemy attack with it, and it makes attacks from that enemy harder to hit you with. Given that those are three of my favorite abilities, and I think they're incredibly strong, you would think I would rate Charm very highly, but unfortunately Charm works in a quite different way from those other abilities that makes it significantly weaker. Charm is a defensive reaction, but it applies after the first attack from an enemy, so it doesn't affect the first attack, meaning that you will only be able to use it against enemies that have multiple attacks and want to hit your character multiple times in a round. And the charm effect itself just prevents that enemy from attacking the caster. So even if you do hit an enemy with multiple shots with the charm effect, they can still just switch targets to one of your allies. Finally, because this is a charm spell being used in combat, enemies always have advantage on the saving throw against it. It is a wisdom saving throw that causes the creature to become charmed, but since they have advantage and it uses the Illithid Power saving throw, the Illithid Power DCs that use the same rules as the item DCs, not every character is going to have a high DC on this, so it will very rarely actually land on enemies, thanks to them having advantage on the save and your DCs possibly being fairly low, and even if it does, it needs a very narrow circumstance where an enemy can only hit the caster and has multiple attacks, all of which are targeting the caster, and the first attack from that enemy doesn't kill you, in order to be effective. Overall, I think that Charm is unfortunately held back just way too much by these abilities. Granted, it's a defensive reaction, so if you don't have anything else to use your reaction on, it can still be very useful. It's just free value if you have no other use for your reaction. And, maybe the enemy fails and then can't make an attack or has to attack a suboptimal target as a result of it. But the times when it comes up, I think, are few and far between enough that I'm still going to rate it D tier. I don't think you need to prioritize this. Obviously, you can still use it when you have the opportunity to, and sometimes you will prevent an enemy attack with it and feel great, but that won't happen too frequently. Displace. Displace is unlocked by Force Tunnel, so there is a little bit of an opportunity cost, because Force Tunnel is one of the weaker ones to unlock with your initial tadpole powers. And Displace is another passive, so it just provides a passive benefit throughout the entire game, where creatures who take falling damage caused by your actions, the actions of the character that knows Displace, take an additional D8 psychic damage on top of the fall damage they would normally take. This is very, very situational, although you can engineer it with Force Tunnel, which you always have access to if you have Displace. But enemies taking falling damage and then taking a little bit of extra damage is just not a powerful effect, so even as a passive, it's just not something that I'm particularly excited about. And the amount of additional damage they take is not terribly relevant throughout the game. It's very rare to trigger this multiple times on the same enemy, so it's maybe getting 1d8 extra damage against one enemy or two in a fight, once every 3 or 4 fights where you can knock enemies off of high ground and deal damage to them. And it's quite buggy. I've seen it just not trigger quite frequently. So Displace overall, the effect is just so small and situational to trigger. Sometimes it doesn't even work at all. 1d8 psychic damage is just not very powerful for falling damage, so it's going to be D tier. There are probably some cool gimmick builds you could do where you like throw enemies up in the air. Maybe a telekinesis build or something with Displace could add a little bit of extra damage to that. And like a Berserker Barbarian who's throwing enemies a lot could make use of this more frequently, but even in builds that are built around it, it's just never going to do that much, so D tier power. Repulsor. Repulsor is, you can kind of think of it as Big Thunder Wave. It is a 30-foot radius around the caster, and everything within it has to make a strength saving throw against your Illithid save DC, or be knocked back 20 feet and take 2d6 force damage. On a successful save, they don't get knocked back, but they still take half damage, so you always do a little bit of guaranteed damage. The problem with this spell is that it's a 30-foot AoE around the caster, and it hits allies, so it's quite difficult to arrange to use this safely without hitting your allies. You have to be at least 30 feet from the rest of your party in order to make use of it. So, while in and of itself it's not a terrible ability, it's hard to finagle situations where you can actually use Repulsor. And again, it has the save DC issue. Strength saves are typically a bad one to target for knockback effects as well, because if you're knocking back enemies around you, you're probably trying to clear space for yourself. Maybe you're a caster trying to move enemies away from you, and the enemies you want to move away from you are likely to have good strength saving throws, because melee enemies often have high strength. And that's who you'd want to knock back. Using it offensively can be more interesting. You can knock enemies off of ledges and stuff, but for that purpose, I'd rather just use Force Tunnel, which does the knockback without any saving throw, rather than try to use Repulsor, which has a saving throw. This is a powerful ability. In a vacuum, it's just very strong. It's a big AoE, does some damage, has a good chance of a very big knockback, but the fact that it is somewhat hard to set up makes it harder to use. So I'm going to rate it C tier and say that it is situational. Overall, I think that this is a fun one that's worth going out of your way to try to engineer situations where you can use it. But for most characters playing the game through naturally, they're going to be hard-pressed in order to find situations where Repulsor isn't just as bad as it is good, because it's going to punt your allies into the sky. Psionic Backlash. Psionic Backlash is unlocked by Concentrated Blast, so there is a little bit of an opportunity cost, because Concentrated Blast is one of the weaker of the starting Illithid powers. And Psionic Backlash is another reaction power, requires your reaction to use. When an enemy casts a spell, if they are within 30 feet of you, it has 30-foot range, you can spend your reaction to deal 1d4 psychic damage to them per level of the spell. This damage can immediately break enemy concentration, so it's pretty useful against enemies that are casting concentration spells, and it's also just good for DPSing down spellcasters. There's no cooldown on this ability, other than it requiring your reaction to use, so you can use it every turn of combat if you want, as long as enemies are casting spells. Also, a lot of abilities that you wouldn't think are spells still trigger this, because a lot of legendary actions from honor mode bosses or racial abilities or class abilities are coded as spells and still trigger Psionic Backlash for certain enemies. So this comes up more often than you would think. It obviously competes with other reactions, most notably Counterspell, which it uses the same picture as, and typically you're going to be better off stopping the enemy spell than dealing a little bit of damage to them, but a little bit of damage for free is pretty nice, and you don't have to put this on a character that has good other uses for their reactions. Spellcasters are often the most threatening enemies, so killing them faster is good, but getting within 30 feet of them to make sure that Psionic Backlash actually works is sometimes a little more difficult than you might think. But overall, if you have this on a character, you're probably going to be able to use it a couple times, like maybe an average of once per fight, because every 3 fights or so has a spellcaster in it, and you can probably use it 3 times in a fight with a spellcaster if that spellcaster lives through the first turn. Maybe a little less than once per fight. But getting a little bit of extra damage on average once per fight, and often in the hardest fights in the game, is pretty good. I would say that this is not a game-changing ability, but it's definitely a nice-to-have that you won't be sad to have. It has very little cost to actually use it, because it just takes your reaction. So I'm going to put it in B tier. It helps out reasonably well in some fights that are particularly challenging. Next, Cull the Weak. Cull the Weak is the other one unlocked by Concentrated Blast, and Cull the Weak is interesting because while it's a powerful ability, spoilers, it's going in S tier, it gets more powerful the more Illithid powers you have unlocked. So it's not necessarily one that you want to rush for, although in general, I think you should still get it within your first 5 or so, because how Cull the Weak works is when you deal damage that brings a creature down to fewer hit points than your total number of evolved Illithid powers. And Illithid Persuasion does count as one of the Illithid powers, so the minimum that this can be is 3. If you just have Illithid Persuasion, Concentrated Blast, and Cull the Weak, any enemy you bring down to 3 health or lower, they die instantly. They also explode, dealing additional damage to every 1d4 additional psychic damage to every creature within 10 feet of it. So it's going to deal a lot of additional damage around itself, and that damage will often apply rider effects from your character. Cull the Weak effectively increases the damage of a lot of your attacks by like 20 in the late game, and even in the early game, just reducing every enemy's health by 5 or so is a pretty powerful effect. It's a passive, it does AoE damage to enemies, it instantly kills enemies through defenses and stuff like that, so some enemies that have abilities that stop them from dying instantly, they just die instantly when you have Cull the Weak available, because it just kills them, it doesn't do damage to them. It bypasses other sources of damage resistance and so on. And that's just an incredibly powerful effect. Any character that's doing damage can benefit from Cull the Weak, and that's most characters in the game, and you will pop so many enemies' brains with this ability that it will deal thousands or tens of thousands of effective damage over the course of the game. The one downside of Cull the Weak is that, for whatever reason, when it kills an enemy, it doesn't count as your character landing the killing blow, so abilities that trigger off of actually killing enemies, like Bloodlust Potions or Great Weapon Master bonus attacks, won't work with Cull the Weak, but you can turn it off if you really if you know you're going to kill an enemy and want to trigger a bonus bloodlust action or something like that. And the amount of damage that you get from this ability is just going to wildly supersede that very minor downside. You don't even have to use those abilities, of course. But if you are, you should be aware that you won't get bloodlust actions from enemies that are killed by Cull the Weak. Just an insanely powerful ability. The number of weird interactions with this ability and boss defenses are too many to list, but I will shorthand it by saying that when in doubt, Cull the Weak beats whatever the enemies are doing. If they get below that hit point threshold, they just die. It doesn't matter what their abilities are, Cull the Weak bypasses them. So you get to also bypass a lot of really powerful defensive options that enemies might have. Cull the Weak, S tier, insane ability, and the reason that taking Concentrated Blast is always worth it, because you always want to unlock Cull the Weak. Oh, also one other important note about Cull the Weak, I'm just jumping back in after finishing that segment, is that it says it deals the damage to nearby creatures, but that's a lie, the tooltip is wrong, it only deals it to enemies. So you can safely use this when your party is mixed up with enemies and not take damage. Shield of Thralls. Shield of Thralls is a pretty cool ability, honestly. It's my favorite design of the Illithid powers, because I just really like this type of effect in games. You'll recognize it if you've played Dota, it's the Abaddon Shield. Shield of Thralls gives you or an ally, as an action, 10 temporary hit points, and then if those temporary hit points are lost, then the shield explodes, stunning any enemy within 30 feet, unless they pass a DC 15 intelligence saving throw. 10 temporary hit points in and of itself, not amazing, but 10 temporary hit points on a short rest cooldown isn't the worst. It's basically an extra cast of a level 2 Armor of Agathis every short rest, which is not bad at all and can be pretty useful, especially if you cast it on a character with damage, mitigation, like an Abjuration Wizard or a Bearheart Barbarian, something like that. You can multiply that damage even further. But also, if the character takes enough damage to break the shield, it stuns every enemy within 30 feet. That's a huge AoE stun. It targets an intelligence save, which is a very good save to target. Enemies will often have very, very low intelligence saving throws, including some bosses. So the stun, even with only a DC 15, is going to get a lot of enemies throughout the game. Stuns are obviously incredible. A one-turn stun will just win, like an AoE one-turn stun is just going to win any combat that it works in. And this will work more often than not because it targets a really good saving throw to target. So Shield of Thralls overall is just a very powerful ability if you can cause it to break. The question for me is basically, does it break into S tier? And I think that the answer is yes, because you can precast it before combat, so it's effectively free, and an AoE stun is just an incredibly strong ability. You can also break it yourself if you want to by damaging your ally. I don't recommend doing that, but situational AoE stuns available on your tank. Any character that's tanking damage can get this. It will stun enemies in the middle of their turn, costing them the rest of their turn. If like their first attack breaks it, then they will lose it on their subsequent attacks. Just a super powerful effect. Sometimes it won't work, of course, and then you'll be sad because the enemies will pass their saving throws, but this is going to stun dozens of enemies over the course of the game, so Shield of Thralls, excellent ability. And finally, Perilous Stakes. So Perilous Stakes is a weird one because it has a significantly different effect on Honor mode and on Tactician mode or below. Perilous Stakes gives a creature vulnerability to all damage, so doubles all incoming damage. It's on a long rest cooldown. It has a 30-foot range, and it takes an action, or again, bonus action. And for 3 turns, the enemies are vulnerable to all incoming damage, or the creature is vulnerable to all incoming damage. But whenever it attacks, whether it hits or not, it gets 2d8 points of healing. On Honor mode, this ability can only be used on allies. On Tactician mode or below, it can be used on enemies as well. The enemy has to pass an intelligence saving throw or receive the effect. Bonus action, vulnerability to all damage for an intelligence save, which they're very likely to fail, is obviously absurd. So on Tactician mode or below, Perilous Stakes cast on enemies is a truly nonsensically powerful ability that will just instantly win any boss fight that you can land it in. I'm going to evaluate it for Honor mode, though, where that application doesn't exist. Damage vulnerability on an ally is very, very bad. You do not want to make your allies vulnerable to damage because they will die. The healing will not keep up with the vulnerability to incoming damage. So you might think that this would be an F tier ability with no use whatsoever. However, there is a use for it, and that is that this just works whenever your ally attacks for 3 turns. And they don't have to be attacking an enemy. They just have to roll an attack roll. So you can use this for out-of-combat healing, even if they only make 3 attacks, like they don't have extra attack or any other sources of additional attacks. That's 6d8 healing out of combat. If you cast it on a character with extra attack, then they can use it use it for 12d8 healing, which gets any character back to full health. Now, I've already mentioned with Transfuse Health that out-of-combat healing isn't something that I think is incredibly important in Baldur's Gate 3, but this is very good out-of-combat healing. It's effectively getting your character back to full for free once per day, which is really nice and will save you resources. I'm still going to rate it D tier because I just don't think that out-of-combat healing is something that I'm particularly interested in investing resources in getting to, but that use case of healing out of combat is pretty powerful and something that you should definitely keep in mind, because sometimes you just need to get your health back, and you want to unlock this to power up Cull the Weak eventually anyways, so sometimes you will use Perilous Stakes for that reason. Putting it all together, we can see that the Illithid powers are incredibly powerful, and there are a lot of extremely strong abilities. Even the weakest abilities available from the Illithid powers are still quite powerful, so again, I want to emphasize that the things I've placed in D tier here are still all very good abilities that can give you a significant bonus throughout the game. The natural question to ask is, what order should you unlock them in? Where should you start, and where should you go from there? I think pretty much every character is going to want to start by unlocking Favourable Beginnings, which is, right in the name, because it's just a passive benefit that will give you a huge amount of value over the course of a playthrough, and it unlocks Luck of the Far Realms, another really high tier ability that any character that's making attack rolls is going to want at some point. Then you probably are going to want, if you are a character that does damage at all, to get Concentrated Blast followed by Cull the Weak. Getting Cull the Weak early will just make your character so much more powerful over the course of the game. And then if you attack, you are going to be looking to unlock Luck of the Far Realms after that, and then probably Psionic Overload, provided that you've succeeded on the Zaith'isk check. Other than that, you're going to pick up Shield of Thralls relatively early, especially if you're a defensive character or are a caster or utility character that doesn't care about the things that work off of attack rolls. So for a caster or utility character, you might go Favourable Beginnings followed by Transfuse Health, followed by Shield of Thralls, something along those lines. Overall, I think, though, Favourable Beginnings is very good, and prioritizing getting Cull the Weak as quickly as possible, even though it scales off of the number of Illithid powers you've unlocked, is typically going to be your best bet, so that's the order that I would recommend. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at the Tier 1 Central and Middle Ring Illithid powers, and if you have, of course, feel free to leave a comment and like the video. Both of those things help me out a ton with the algorithm, and if you disagree with any of my placements, definitely do let me know. As always with these tier lists, I'm very interested in community feedback, and have moved things in the past and will move things in the future if you come up with, if you give me a persuasive argument why something should be somewhere else. Of course, with tier lists, this is always an emotional subject for people, so do keep it civil in the discussions. I don't care if you're mad at me, but please be nice to one another. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for part 2 of this tier list and other Baldur's Gate 3 strategy guides, and indeed other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.